As the world is closely watching the ceasefire negotiations unfold, the echoes of Tuesday's call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin remain. Russia persists in its refusal to make any concessions to accommodate any terms of the ceasefire, and it's seen as a sign of victory in Russia. To talk all things ceasefire, I'm joined by Daniel Hamilton, president of the Transatlantic Leadership Network. Good evening, sir, and thank you for joining me on the program.
Good to be with you.
So Steve Witkoff expects a full ceasefire in Ukraine to take effect within 2 weeks. How can he be so certain, and what are the chances of this happening, actually?
Well, I don't think he can be certain because it depends on the parties to the conflict, and I don't think that timeline is any remotely relevant to what's really happening. The discussion between President Trump and President Putin really revealed that Russia is making no concessions really at all on its maximal demands. President Trump talked to President Zelenskyy after the call, and the Ukrainians were rather quiet about what it was all about. So they're meeting in Riyadh on so-called technical talks about just the energy infrastructure pause. So that's not leading to a ceasefire at all. So I think this will go on for some time.
Mm-hmm. So as we said previously, Russia made no concessions so far to accommodate the ceasefire, even though Mr. Putin said that he is actually going to suspend the attacks on vital infrastructure in Ukraine. And last night he attacked yet again. So at what point do you think that the U.S. is actually going to take action and address the game that Vladimir Putin is playing?
Well, it's really hard to see. It seems that President Trump has a different game in mind, which is to sort of reset U.S. relations with Russia more broadly, and Ukraine, unfortunately, seems to potentially be a casualty of that ambition. But these are negotiations. They go back and forth. I think the main point is President Trump's unlikely to succeed in his 100-day, timetable to settle this conflict. He's not able to impose peace just by personality. These are intractable issues. As you mentioned, the Russians attacked the Ukrainians as soon as President Putin got off the phone with President Trump. So I think this will go on for some time, unfortunately.
So it seems to be the case that Russians know Mr. Trump and they know how to appease him. But the question is, does he know them? And why is he actually refusing to listen to some of America's age-old allies? What is the dynamic here?
Well, your guess is as good as mine. It's hard to read into the mind of Donald Trump. He thinks that, personalities matter, that you can get in a room with another leader and simply negotiate a deal. But in a play on what he said to President Zelenskyy, Donald Trump doesn't really have the cards. He could impose severe penalties on Russia, as he has sort of punched Zelenskyy in Ukraine, but he has chosen so far not to do that.
Do you think he will at any point?
So it leaves the Europeans with real problems.
Do you think that he will actually, for example, use sanctions in order to put pressure on Russia?
Well, in one tweet or one, social media post, he said he would if they don't do something. That was a while ago, though. But just before that, he said, I think we'll be loosening our sanctions on Russia. So he said things completely opposed to each other, and that's why it's very hard to know. And we'll have to see how these talks go. But the fact that they continue to have discussions without the Ukrainians really part of it doesn't seem to argue very well for success of this. And the Europeans, of course, are completely sidelined. So I doubt that this is going to go anywhere anytime soon.
And do you think it possible for President Trump to actually consider Russia's call to suspend all intelligence sharing and military aid to Ukraine?
Well, he did that already, but he did that as a tactic to simply tell Zelenskyy that he was serious about getting to the negotiating table. He hasn't sort of gone back on that now. I'm not sure that he would, because he already tried that tactic. And so the Europeans have stepped in to provide other types of intelligence, but of course there's no real substitute for the U.S. So it's one of the quivers in his arrow as he tries to force both sides of the table. But his quiver seems to be empty when it comes to Putin. And that's why I don't think there's going to be much movement here, because the Russian side hasn't really agreed to anything, except maybe some pause on energy infrastructure, but then they have a drone attack the very next day. So even that didn't seem to hold up very long.
Do you think that this is the reason why Mr. Trump is actually deciding to play ball into Russia's court instead of Ukraine's?
Well, he did, but the Russians served the ball right back. So now it's in his court again, because they said, okay, here are our conditions. This is an old Soviet tactic. You play along, you solve for time. Putin thinks he's doing well on the ground right now. He wants to evict the Ukrainians from Russian territory so they don't have that card to play. And so, the longer this goes on in his mind, with the Ukrainians disoriented, the Americans unreliable, and the Europeans still having meetings, he thinks he can get a better advantage, in the war itself. And I think that's part of the play here.
It seems to be that Washington these days seems to pay a lot of attention to the proverb, pardon me, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. This seems to be the case taking place with Russia, sort of leaving, for example, the European allies behind. How do you think this is going to benefit the U.S.?
Well, I don't think it will, but if you ask me what the thinking might be, as I say, I think the thinking among some members of Trump's group is the real challenge is China. And, if the Ukraine war wasn't happening, Europe would be stable and wouldn't have much of an interest or, stake in that. And you could turn your full attention to China. And if you can somehow play the card with Russia and loosen its ties to China, that's a bonus. So I think there are some who are really fixated on China rather than Ukraine, and Ukraine's sort of in the way. Unfortunately, that's what some others are thinking. This is all a test of the Europeans. Will they really just finally stand up and pay for their own security like they should? There's a strong view among many of Trump's supporters that it's time for the Europeans to take care of their own defense. The problem, of course, is that even if Europe does more, there are certain capabilities that only the United States has, not just for Ukraine, but for Europe. And that's the problem.
Thank you so much, Daniel Hamilton, president of the Transatlantic Leadership Network. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
And so this is all for now here on World News Tonight, but please do stay tuned. Back in just a moment with more news and features here on TVP World.